Welcome to Master of Science with host Professor James McCanney. The good professor's career spans 50 years as a university teacher, scientist, and engineer. Each week, he will explore the rapidly changing world of science as many long-held theories are crumbling under the weight of new data. He will cover the fields of geology, archaeology, meteorology, oceanography, space science, astronomy, cosmology, biological evolution, virology, energy, mathematics, and more. So please welcome the host of Master of Science, James McCanney.
Good evening. Tonight we're going to have a little bit of a different format. I was on an interview recently with Kevin Gallagher. He has a radio network. It's called Truth Be Told Radio Network. And we did an interview. He interviewed me a couple days ago. And so I asked him, I said, this really had a good flow to it, a lot of good information. And can I use that for my television show? And he said, sure, great. So here you go. This is an interview, once again, Kevin Gallagher, Truth Be Told Radio Network. And interview just some general topics that are very important to understand in a composite sense. And I talk about these things on my radio show, television shows, etc. But this one just had a lot of good pieces that came together at the same time. So here you go. You'll first see Kevin introducing me and then the interview for this show.
We have Professor James McCanney here. I want to welcome him into the program. And Professor, it's really great to see you once again. And anything you'd like to add about yourself that I didn't include just now?
Well, I've been around for, about 50 years professionally. And so I've been working on space science issues and confronting NASA with the baloney they put out. Mm-hmm. Also, just a lot of work I do in archaeology. My latest book is dealing with the history of man, anthropology. So I cover a really wide range of topics. I have publications in mathematics, pure mathematics, dealing with math analysis and other topics. So I cover quite a wide range of topics.
Hey, let me ask you this. I don't know if I've ever asked you this question before, and that is, how did you actually what first interest you? How did you initially get interested in researching things like science and physics and the things that you're into? What was it that first got your attention about it?
Even when I was in grade school, I was probably about 7th or 8th grade when I noticed and my teachers noticed that I was like a step ahead of other kids in math. And so, then in high school, it was pretty clear I was, somewhere in a league of my own, and never really understood that I was really kind of light years ahead. And then I got into college. I got a full ride scholarship, room and board, the whole thing, to a private school that had a very intense physics program. So I ended up getting a double major, physics and mathematics. And then I went on to get a master's degree in physics, and they offered me the program to get a PhD. And I said, no, I don't want to specialize. And that was one of the best decisions I ever made. And so I spent, when I was young, instead of going right to grad school after college, I went to Mexico, and I lived in Mexico for a couple of years. I taught in the high school there, in a American high school with students from all over the world. Wow. But what I had, when I went there, I said, well, I need a good vehicle. So I got a brand new Ford Econoline window van, and it was, I drove it off the lot new. So I took it to Mexico, and within a year and a half, I had 50,000 miles on it. Huh. And so I drove it all over Mexico. So I knew Mexico. But what I did was I was studying archaeology and the past, all of the ruins, etc., of Mexico. And so in those early days, this is like 1971, 72, I got a really good view of some serious archaeological ruins, some that were being dug up for the very first time. And all of this would contribute later to the physics that I would be doing. And one of the things I always was interested in from high school was in prime numbers. And so eventually I ended up solving some of the world's oldest math problems. And also, I was very interested in something called celestial mechanics. In other words, how do the planets work, the orbits of the planets, etc. And so I was, after I got my master's degree, I went to a foreign country and I was teaching physics, mathematics, and computer science in a foreign language. And so eventually, but what I was doing in the background was my own research on mathematics and what is known as the three body problem. When you have n bodies, like the solar system, how do they work gravitationally? And so I was studying that. And I decided to put electric and magnetic fields into this. And this is before I really had access to data, things like that. And so eventually I ended up in a little town called Ithaca, New York. And it's very strange how I ended up there. But anyway, I'm not going to go into all of that. But I was working as a carpenter, actually, in a carpentry shop where they were making wooden furniture. And because I had a lot of background in woodworking, etc. But anyway, Cornell University is in Ithaca, New York. So I thought, maybe I should just go up to Cornell and see if I can get in and into their physics program and finish my PhD. That was my intent. So I went up there, filled out an application. I came back for my interview, and the head of the physics department says, "Well, we're maxed out. We're many years in advance with students trying to get in here for grad school, but you can teach here." So he offered me a teaching job because I was multilingual. I had been teaching physics, mathematics, computer science in multiple languages. And so they needed that. And even though I had a master's degree, they hired me. So I become a faculty member at Cornell. And all of a sudden, this is when all this data is coming in from space probes, from Venus, from Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, the Voyager, Pioneer programs. And so I have access to all this data. And so I had been working with electric fields in celestial mechanics. And so I started going to these afternoon meetings, which they would hold up in the space science department in Cornell. And I'm going, my goodness, here's all my theoretical work happening in real life. And then I noticed that the NASA scientists who were resident there had no clue what was going on. They had absolutely no clue. And so I started publishing papers. And it wasn't long into my publishing career that they they didn't like it.
They didn't like
and
it.
So they did not like that I was publishing papers and basically saying that the theories that NASA was proposing for comets and planetary formation and everything else was totally incorrect. And I was,
what's interesting is even in science fiction, you'll like I think what was it, Armageddon, where they're going, after a killer asteroid or whatever. The standing theory is that comets are these big, beautiful snowballs floating through space, but yet even Star Trek and you have these other Deep Impact, when they get on the asteroid, it's not a snowball. They're showing you a hard, dense piece of rock. So if they're depicting it one way in the movies, why do they insist that it's this like big giant snowball, floating through space?
Yeah, well, the whole thing never made any sense. And anyway, I started publishing my papers, and I got into literally a political battle there on campus, and they were very angry at me. I mean, it wasn't like they were saying, "Well, gee, Jim, we disagree with you," or whatever. They were violently angry, and so they called me in, the head of the physics department. He said, "You cannot talk to the students about this." So they actually had a woman. Her name was Betty Richardson, She was a PhD. She was on the faculty there. Her job was to follow me around campus and make sure I didn't talk to students. And it was interesting. They didn't fire me. I kept teaching there, and my teaching was good. And so I thought, this is pretty uncomfortable. So I went across campus and I was actually set up an office in the mathematics department. And then they ended up hiring me there.
Wow.
So I ended up teaching calculus for a couple of years in the mathematics department. And then I started publishing my papers again. And they came across campus and said, we want you to get rid of this guy. Anyway, that's a long story. But the point is that I was there at a time, it was one of those be in the right place at the right time things.
Mm-hmm.
When I had all my work done, my theoretical work, all this data is coming in, and so I'm starting to realize that this is reflecting everything that I'm doing in my theoretical work, the data. And so anyway, that started my career, which has continued to today.
Interesting.
And so I had access to, like in a lot of people there, I would go and talk to Hans Bethe. Hans Bethe was a resident scientist there. He was brought over in Operation Paperclip, and he was part of the Manhattan Project. So he had worked on nuclear fusion, and he actually had won a Nobel Prize for understanding the theoretical work behind large chain nuclear synthesis. And so anyway, I would talk to him, and he helped me out get the right lead to some paper, some journals, scientific journals in astrophysics and space science in Europe, in the Netherlands. And so I was publishing my articles, and when the other shoe dropped, so to speak, and they wanted him to get rid of me. And so he called me into his office one day. Professor Wolfgang Fuchs was his name. He was a German. He might have been with the paperclip operation too. But anyway, he was the chairman of the mathematics department. He said, James, I don't know what to do with you here. He said, your teaching is really good. The students love you. They want you to continue teaching. And you are the only person in the mathematics department in the history of Cornell who is published in astrophysics journals, in peer-reviewed and so, and he said, they want me to fire you.
Yeah.
So they won out. That's all I can tell you. He told me, he said, well, we'll see what happens, but they just put the pressure on him to get rid of me. But that launched my career, and which went through, now I have a television show, I have my 25-year radio show. I've remained as a active scientist in tier 1 level science throughout my career. And so, I've been to a leading scientist in a lot of these fields, and I'm still being actively published in peer-reviewed journals. Anyway, that's a little bit of history about where I got to today. But many decades through the 80s, the 90s, 2000s, 2010s, the 2020s, up to now. And so that was like 45 years ago. So a lot of water has gone under the bridge. And so I've revisited my archaeology work. For example, I was in Peru in 2015, and I went to the Nazca Lines and discovered that the Nazca Lines are fractal antennas. They're radio antennas. And so the whole point of those antennas is that they're big enough and powerful enough to transmit and receive from other star systems. So we don't know who built them. And there again, the one thing I always talk about when I have my TV show or I'm on a guest like this is the tremendous amount of misinformation that just flows out constantly from the news media, which is sponsored by NASA and what I call tier 2 science. For example, you couldn't miss this recently. They're talking about hundreds of new Nazca lines that were discovered supposedly by artificial intelligence. It's a complete misinformation story, complete disinformation, because nobody discovered new Nazca lines. And the real Nazca lines are huge. They have rocks moved to create these patterns. And the new ones they're finding are like smudges on the desert floor the size of your desk. So anyway, then they say, oh, these were due to prayers. People walking around these little paths, they would say prayers, and they're talking about the Nazca people. There's no history of who created these things.
Right,
and so for them to make up a story that, oh, this was the some group of people known as the Nazca people is complete lie, fabrication, and misinformation, because we don't know who built the real Nazca lines, but you see how they covered up. They put the frosting on the cake so you don't see the cake.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, the obvious question then is, why do they do that? Why just make up a whole bunch of BS, put it out to the public, when a lot of times when I look at, what they're putting out, it doesn't really even seem to benefit them. So
Well, it's
why?
yeah. If you've been in this business as long as I have, I've seen, for example, radio shows taken over, where they'll take over a radio show. Joe Rogan is a good example. Big radio show. But as he was getting traction, all of a sudden he had some problems, some legal problems. They found out anyway, they come in, they give him handlers, they start putting people on his show that are, I call them street people. They're people with really no background, and spouting something about archaeology or events in history of man or history of Earth, and they promote these people. I call them street people because, like I say, they really don't have any legitimacy of any kind. But the point is, and so this is back to your question, why did they do this?
Mm-hmm.
Why do they have this tremendous amount of misinformation? Why do they take over radio and television shows? If you look at National Geographic or Wikipedia, or I could go on and on, History Channel, Discovery Channel, they're all completely controlled misinformation. Chat GPT now went in and just lifted out of Wikipedia all this misinformation that has been put there over years and years. And the reason is, it took me a long time to figure out what the real reason was. I was on a show, it might have been the late 1990s. I was on a show as a guest with Art Bell. Remember Art Bell, a long time, big talk show host, started the Coast to Coast AM radio show, which is now hosted by George Norrie. But Art Bell had 600 radio stations at night. He had made this into this colossal listen to radio show. Everybody was listening to Art Bell at night. So they came in and they destroyed him. They made all these false accusations that he was, and I won't even go through it all. But anyway, the real, I was on Art's show. It was a Christmas special we were doing. We did a Christmas special every year. And he came out and he asked me one time, he said, James, what's going on with your work? Why do they suppress it so much? It's clear that you're correct. I mean, here's a guy who was not a scientist, knew that I was right about everything I was doing, and the level of suppression. And then why would they keep this, like you're saying, this dirty snowball model around when it clearly has no validity at all, never did? Why do they keep pawning this off on the public? And it turns out, and anyway, I responded to Art. I said, well, they'd have to change all the textbooks. The peer-reviewed journals would be wrong. They'd have egg all over their face. And he said, no. Art was very perceptive. He said, no, something else is going on. He said something much bigger, because they could fix all that. They could kill you. They They could take all your material, steal it, and pretend they created it and publish it in peer-reviewed journals. They could fix all that.
Yeah.
But there's something bigger going on here. And at the time, I didn't really realize it. And then after time went on and I started seeing this, and I would see, for example, journalists. I'd go to an American Geophysical Union meeting, and NASA would have some meeting about Hale-Bopp or comet. Um, there's various other comets that they would have a meeting about. But anyway, I was going to the one, and I get in the elevator, and I'm going up to the third floor where the meeting was, and they wouldn't allow me to go in. But I'm in the elevator alone with a journalist, and I'd never seen him before. He was rather new. And I said, why don't you ask this question about the dirty snowball comet model? And so anyway, he did. He got fired.
You got fired.
He got fired for asking the wrong question in a meeting.
Right.
And but anyway, so after a while, you start going, yeah, something else is going on here. And what it is that due to other things also, I started realizing, like Operation Paperclip and the CIA. The CIA is not an American organization. The CIA is the police force of the World Bank.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the World Bank controls all the governments of the world, pretty much all the big businesses, oil, water control. That's what climate change is all about. It's about controlling water and natural resources. But I started to realize that the CIA is the police force of the World Bank. And they're the ones that control NASA, that control the information flow, the news media, all of this. Like when they went after Trump, for example, not to be political, but I mean, all of that, Russian collusion and all of that came out of the CIA, of which the FBI is a subdivision.
Right.
And so anyway, they control the information flow that goes out to the public. And you think, well, what's the big deal about space science? It's astronomy, or their planets, or comets, or, who cares what they're made of? Here is the crux of the issue. You have to go back to the World Bank. It's run out of it's the Vatican Bank, with the front agency is the Rothschild banking community, which they also call the International Monetary Fund, which goes into nations, gives them loans, which they can't pay back, then goes in and rapes and pillages their natural resources, with the United States and Britain as their front agencies, to do all of this. And the CIA is housed in the United States. But anyway, back to the crux of this issue. The CIA protects. Now, you have to understand one last thing. You have the World Bank. They own everything. They control the governments. They appoint presidents. They assassinate people. People don't understand the history of the control of the Vatican. We just had a new pope. Very political. Very, very political election. But anyway, what is the one thing they need? They have power, they have money, they control businesses, they control governments, they can ruin governments, they can establish governments, they can control things. So power is the thing. They are power crazy.
Yes.
And what is what is the biggest thing a power crazy entity wants? And that is continued power.
Right.
So they don't want anything to interfere in the mind of the people. So let's go back to the Middle Ages. This is not new. They were teaching the public that the world was flat Earth, from the pulpit. And they would teach, and why were they doing that? Well, it was a mental prison. It was a mental prison. If you had a young, strapping man, a group of men, don't go out onto that ocean there, because you're going to fall off the edge, and there's breathing dragons, and you're going to all die. So don't do it. And so when Columbus went across the ocean, he knew the world was round, but none of the men did. That's why they were mutinying. And so anyway, it's a mental control, and they continue that to today. So what's the one thing they don't want people to understand about? That comets have a very big influence on the history of man. They have been instrumental in the Noah's event. The Noah's flood was, we went through the tail of a comet for about 40 days and 40 nights, torrential rain, the entire world, the ocean levels rose 200 feet. The Moses event, when Moses is coming out of Egypt with the Israelites, is a time when Venus, the comet, was coming by, and all of the plagues were leading up to the actual encounter. They were due to electrical effects of this large comet. Mars today is without any oceans, and NASA is out there. Oh, billions of years ago, Mars had oceans. No, it was within the last number of thousands of years, and the ancients saw the comet come by Mars and lift the oceans off. Mm-hmm. So what's the one thing they realized that the people out here would realize in a New York second is if a big comet came into the solar system and they really knew what it was, the power of the earthly based power syndicates would be negated instantly, because people go,
they didn't
none
have
of
the
those
power
people
to control the universe.
That's right. It's bigger than they are. So do you understand now?
Mm-hmm. I get it. I get it.
So I had to explain all of this. And so if you look now, when the United States somewhat restructured over the past 20 years after, or 30 years, 40 years, after they knocked off John Kennedy, who was the last president who really was taking control of the presidency, they had to get rid of him because he thought he was president. They don't have, so what do they bring? Ever since, it's been puppets. Reagan thought he was going to be president, and they shot him, put him out of commission. But other than that, it's been just people who they installed, basically. There's been no free elections up until Trump came along. And that's something they are, that's why you see all of this cannon fodder coming out of the CIA and the FBI to get rid of Trump, because they don't want him. They don't want a person that's
going on, because I say it every day almost to my wife is, wow, I never thought I'd see fill in the blank happen in my lifetime.
Yeah,
I mean, it's just one thing after another. And the news cycle, when you go back to the last guy, I mean, the news cycle was like 6-8 months before anything would actually happen. And now if you wait, an hour, you better refresh a bunch of times, because the whole news cycle is completely different. Things are happening at such a rapid rate. That it's incredible. And it's kind of amusing too, because the news media, I'll put that in little quotes, they got used to the very slow pace that the last guy had, and they didn't know what to do when Trump came in, because things were moving at a minute by minute basis. But
he'll troll them also. He'll troll the news.
It's hysterical.
And they don't know it. But there again, CNN was originally owned by Ted Turner.
Yeah.
And it started out as, remember the first Gulf War under George Bush Sr., both George Bush Sr. and Saddam Hussein were getting their news from CNN, who has boots on the ground on location. And so after the end of that war, the CIA said, we can't have this. So they bought CNN from Ted Turner.
Right.
And turned it into what it is now, the Candy Nugget News. And they control it. And you wonder, clearly their numbers are so low that they cannot be supported by advertisement. Well, it's the CIA pumping money into them to keep them floating and keep the misinformation going out.
Right.
But a strange thing has happened. It's called the internet. And so all of a sudden, the news is not fabricated and controlled through a couple of outlets. It used to be, remember, you'd go into an airport and CNN was always on the airport. Yeah. Whatever TVs in the airport.
They even had an airport network. They had a special thing set up just to go out to the airports.
Right. And that was the daily news.
Yeah.
And so, anyways,
we go from Walter Cronkite saying that's the way it is, and now we got 19 million different ways that you can gather information. I mean, they can be watching this program or one of the many other programs they can find out on YouTube. Well, YouTube is very controlled. Rumble, number of other places, podcasts galore. You can find, any place where you want to find a particular type of information. But one thing I'd like to get into with you is, you were talking about Noah's flood. You were talking about Venus and Mars. Now, I had looked at the flood extensively through the years, the biblical account. And, the one thing that I pretty much came to the conclusion of is that whatever came by Mars, whether it was a large asteroid or if it was actually what we call the planet Venus now, ripped all that water off of there and deposited it here, and that's what really caused that event. Because one thing I've tracked with you that you've talked about is that Venus became rogue, and it caused a lot of problems.
Yeah, well, let's start with the Noah's flood, which was a separate event, by the way. It was not related to the Mars
Not related.
event.
Okay.
No, and so in fact, we have had in recent history, 1991 to 97, there was a comet called Hale-Bopp. And there again, NASA completely lied about this. It was a planetary-sized object that came into the solar system. And originally, when it was first discovered, it was discovered by a professional astronomer at the Naval Observatory called Robert Harrington. And he was under contract because they had been looking for this object since the 1700s, since the Herschel, father-son Herschel pair. But they were looking, they found Neptune and Uranus looking for this object, Planet X. And it was something, and then they found Pluto. Clyde Tomlinson found that by accident, and then they realized in fact, it was Harrington who discovered the companion to Pluto, which is called Charon, a moon. And with that, they realized, well, wait a minute, that thing is way too small. That Pluto thing out there is too small. And so something was pulling down on Uranus and Neptune and the other planets. And it had to be like about 4 times the mass of Earth. So Harrington is looking for this thing. He finally discovers it. Original photographs were in 1989. He went back to New Zealand because it was down in the solar system. You could only see it from a vantage point of May and June from a lower latitude like New Zealand. So he goes there, he takes the photographs, comes back with the data, and identifies this planetary-sized object with a companion. Because it has the companion, they can calculate the mass, and they go, this is it. They found it. And he was under contract to NASA to discover this Planet X object. Eventually it comes in, and when it explodes into brightness, it becomes a comet and discharging the solar capacitor. And there again, comets are not ice balls that melt in the solar wind. That's absurd. And this is where my theoretical work comes in, because what I did is I explained what comets really are. It's an electrical effect in the solar system. The sun is putting out an excess current of protons in the solar wind, creates a capacitor. These objects come in and discharge it. The Earth is discharging it all the time. So are the other planets and moons. And so anyway, you have to understand that all of the information that has been put into astronomy textbooks, college, university, and what I call tier 2 science, these astronomers and astrophysicists that work in universities that publish in peer-reviewed papers, that's all tier 2 science. It's garbage science. They put a lot of effort into, and that's why none of that changed. I taught astronomy in the early 1990s at the university level. And the textbooks that they were using then are the same ones that they're using now. They haven't changed, But the point is, okay, let's get back to...
It's very unusual, but please continue.
Yeah. But if we would have passed through the tail of Hale-Bopp, the point is, when Harrington first discovered the Planet X, which they literally called Planet X and its companion, it was on a near direct collision course with Earth. And they went bananas. I mean, this was, so this is when NASA was taken over by the CIA. A guy named Dan Golden became the head of NASA, came out of the CIA to put the lid on it. And I knew all of these people at NASA at the time, at Goddard and JPL, even the secretaries and, the staff. They knew me. And all of a sudden it just shut down because they all had to sign non-disclosure agreements. And a lot of them retired. A lot of them were elderly. But anyway, that's when NASA really had the lid put on it. And from then on, scientists could not go up to the microphone and say anything. Everything was controlled by news release agencies, one out of Goddard, one out of JPL. And anyway, if we would have gone through the tail of Hale-Bopp, it would have been another Noah's event.
Wow.
A couple, probably 30, 40 days, not quite as long. It would have been more like 12 days of torrential rain, because we would be going through this comet tail. But as it turned out, the tail drag of the comet slowed that nucleus down, that the Planet X object, which was then called Hale-Bopp, because it was discovered by these two guys, Hale and Bopp, in around 1995 officially. But NASA knew about it since 1989 and kept it secret.
And this is the comet that crashed into Jupiter, correct?
No, that was Schumacher-Levy 9. That was
Shoemaker-Levy.
Right, right. But anyway, the point is that the Noah's flood, and we don't know what comet it was, but Earth went through the tail of this comet for about a month. And so it was just torrential rain. And the reason that the prediction, Noah had the prediction from Enoch. Anyway, the ancients had enough information where they could understand celestial orbits, and they knew that this flood was coming. So Noah built the ark. He spent a number of years building this ark and populating it with all the animals, etc. And when the rain started, before that, the population of Earth was probably equal to what it is today before the Great Flood.
Wow.
But you understand, if you talk to anybody in, say the Catholic Church or any of the religious sects, and you ask them about the Great Flood, they go, "Oh, that's just kind of mythology. We don't really believe that." So they don't. It's really subdued information.
Right.
But mankind, one of the most striking events in man's history, the Noah's flood, is completely obfuscated. And now you have a bunch of clowns running around the internet saying, "Oh, an asteroid hit Earth and it caused some glacier to melt, and that was Noah's flood." Now, all of these other explanations, but they never get to the real one because they don't want the public to understand what comets really are, because it's, like I say, if the public woke up one day and realized that, these comet things are beyond the control of the controllers, you would stop making your house payment, your insurance payment, everything in society would break down. And it all stems from the banking system.
Right.
The banking system is in control, not the governments, mind you, like the people I get a kick out of. Remember, Barbara Walters was interviewing Reagan. And she goes, "Why don't you just go over there and tell that head of the Federal Reserve what to do and to bring down interest rates?" And Reagan goes, "Well, they're autonomous. They're independent. They're not, and he's trying to explain it to her. They don't answer to me, the president, and so she just couldn't understand that.
Yeah.
And that's how much the people are fooled, that the banking system in the United States is operated by the Rothschild Banking International Monetary Fund out of Rome.
Because people don't realize how powerful the Vatican Bank is.
Yeah.
That's something. Many of our banks worldwide are modeled after the Vatican Bank.
Yeah, and this conflict between China and the United States is a joke. China belongs to the World Bank too.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just people just don't understand. And this is their big beef with Putin. Is Putin withdrew? He created his own banking system, and that's what the BRICS is all about. And they just are angry because they're not catering to, and the US dollar was the basic monetary standard worldwide,
Hmm.
not the British
Yes.
pound anymore. It's the US dollar. And of course, the US has the military to enforce it.
Hmm.
And so you find that the puppet governments all around the world are all indebted to the Vatican Bank.
Yeah.
And now they say, oh, the Chinese are coming in and loaning. Well, it's the same deal, you know. Uh, but
Yeah,
anyway,
they all feed off of the same banking system, and what I will say is this, and we'll move on, which is anytime you see these quote rogue nations that everybody's having such a big problem with, they're not hooked into the Rothschild banking system. That is the main problem that they're having with them,
yeah,
and
Venezuela, Cuba,
all of them. So
Brazil.
that's the whole key there. If you understand that, then a lot of things just click into place.
Yeah.
What I'd like to ask you about is we were talking about this before we went on the air, and that was Emmanuel Velikovsky. I hope I'm not butchering his name. He had it was said that Einstein, right after he passed away, they found his book Worlds in Collision open on his desk. So let me confirm that with you here on the air, and also why would he be reading that book? What was so interesting to Einstein that he, the day that he died or whatever, he was reading this book?
Yeah. Well, okay. So let me fill in a few blanks here.
Please do.
When I had some of my papers published in a journal, a peer-reviewed journal. It was called Chronos. But the main editor was a guy named Warner Sizemore,
Okay.
and it dealt with Velikovsky type issues. And of course, my work fit right in because it explained what Velikovsky was saying, that these big comets come through the solar system. Velikovsky was talking about one in particular, the Venus comet, that eventually became the planet Venus. And this is confirmed all around the world. The Popol Vuh, the Mayans, they talk about Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent god of the night sky, whose heart became the planet Venus. All of the different Peru, the Incas, and then we have this worldwide disaster that we have history of, the Moses event,
Hmm.
when Moses is coming out of Egypt with the Israelites. The plagues, remember the pillar of fire that lifts up into the sky? That was the electrical discharge between the comet and Earth. And you find a lot of the sites in Egypt, which are completely blown apart and scorched with some kind of tremendous force. And it was due to that Venus event. But anyway, Warner Sizemore was the editor. He was Velikovsky's personal secretary. He lived in Princeton next to Velikovsky, and he was pretty much all the time at Velikovsky's house. And I interviewed Warner, and I have some CDs of him, but he told me he knew everything about Velikovsky, and Einstein would come over to Velikovsky's house, and a lot of times in the evening, and play his violin, and then they'd eat supper and talk. So Velikovsky and Einstein were good friends. Well, of course, they were Jewish. They both were brought in. Einstein was brought in, around World War II time frame, was the person who instigated the Manhattan Project with his letter to Roosevelt. And so Warner Sizemore is privy to all this whole decades of being with Velikovsky, with Einstein being his good friend at Princeton. So anyway, that's one thing you have to know. And there's a lot of effort today to try and negate that, Velikovsky's influence on Einstein. Okay, so what is Velikovsky's theme? He's talking about electrical conditions in the solar system, that big lightning bolts would come from Jupiter to like the comet Venus, and that Venus came from Jupiter. And it turns out it was actually captured. That's one thing I discovered in my work, knowing about celestial mechanics. Velikovsky said that Venus popped out of Jupiter. Well, that's what the ancients saw. That's the first time they saw Venus as a visible comet object, is when it came out of Jupiter, but it was actually captured. And that's the initial process. A very similar thing happened with Hale-Bopp. But at any rate, okay, so what is Einstein studying? Einstein's main work was what they call the unification of the fields. So if you have electricity, and one of Einstein's major works also was general relativity, where you had the bending of light around supposedly a massive object due to space-time, the curvature of space-time. But Einstein didn't believe it. Einstein, in his own biography, it was called Out of My Later Years, he makes a statement in there. He says, general relativity is incomplete. It doesn't include the total field, which includes electricity and magnetism. And his question is, how can a massive object through mass bend light when we don't know of any effects from charge and magnetic fields, from electric and magnetic fields? And he's right. And that's something I discovered eventually, is that the gravitational lensing thing is not correct. It's due to electrical effects. But anyway, I diverge from the main topic. So anyway, Einstein, in his later years, was studying the unification of the field, a very intricate problem with tensor analysis, a lot of mathematics, etc. And that's something I did, is I included electric and magnetic fields in celestial mechanics. That's why I understand a lot of these issues. And Einstein didn't know about the solar wind. A lot of the things we know about today were unknown to Einstein. But anyway, he understood that general relativity was incomplete because it did not include electric and magnetic fields. So what does it have to do with Velikovsky? Well, Velikovsky's talking about the ancients seeing electrical conditions around Earth and in the solar system when these special events occur. Okay, does that start to put the picture together?
Yep, sure does.
So why does he have Velikovsky's book open, everything else pushed aside in the middle of his desk? Because that is the key to understanding what he was missing in understanding in his quest to understand the unification of the fields. That's a physics point of view. And to this day, a lot of people don't realize that, because they're, again, in tier 2 science, they're claiming that there can be no electric and there can be no electric fields in outer space. They talk about magnetic fields, but in plasma environment of outer space, you just cannot have magnetic fields existing by themselves. It's not like a rock of iron in Earth's crust that has a locked-in magnetic field. In the plasma, there's no locked-in magnetic field. There's no solid, so to speak. And so you cannot have magnetic fields in outer space without electrical currents. That's Maxwell's laws. And so at any rate, that's why modern astrophysics, space science, and astronomy are so distorted, because they have no clue what's going on. They don't include electric and magnetic fields. They can measure the magnetic fields, but they don't know where they come from, and deny the fact that you need electric fields in outer space that create the electrical currents that therefore create the magnetic fields. It's the only way it can happen. And there again, now let's look at funding. This is the fun part of funding, is that they can control what these people put out, tier 2 science. And so nobody is allowed to upset the apple cart. So they're not allowed, and this was solidified by a guy named Carl Sagan. When I was at Cornell, 79 to 81 timeframe, Carl Sagan was becoming a movie star in Hollywood, doing the Cosmos series, 20 episodes, and then the big book Cosmos coming out. And so he set down the rules for astrophysics, space science, and man. And he said, okay, evolution, slow evolution, the Big Bang, where everything started, slow evolution over billions of years, all the planets evolve, and the next thing you know, you're driving your SUV up and down the road. What could be wrong with that? So the evolution of the planets and cosmos, evolution, slow evolution, I might add, of the biological species. And nobody can stray from that, because if they do, they're ostracized or thrown out, and this includes astronomy. When I was at Cornell, they had just started a new department. It was called astroastronomy. And I talked to the chairman of the department there. And anyway, he told me, he said, I understand what you're doing here. You're in conflict with these space scientists, but he said, I can't do anything. He said, I understand that, this has great ramifications in archaeology because these major destructive events that destroyed entire civilizations are related to things that are not permitted to be talked about in the sciences. So here he is studying archaeology, trying to figure out why these massive civilizations just went under overnight, why mastodons are flash frozen in Siberia. When it was a temperate climate at the time, there had been a pole shift. You couldn't talk about any of this.
Yeah, you couldn't talk about it.
And so anyway, that's tier 2 science.
And they're all controlled through funding. So we got a few more minutes left, but one thing I'd like to clarify for people is you're talking about tier 2 science. What is that? Because if somebody doesn't have any idea what that is, what is there a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, 4, 5? How does that work? What is it?
Yeah, let me start from the top. Tier 1 science is what I call military science. This is the science that's owned and operated by the world banks. And I've been associated. I've never signed contracts in NASA or anything like that. But NASA, what you see is tier 2 science. It's the BS science. The rockets going off into space, that's not the way to go into space. That's a dog and pony show. Let's take, for example, the American Geophysical Union meetings, 20,000 scientists from around the world getting together and discussing published papers and results of Mars missions and everything else. Tier 2 science, just complete garbage. And they go year after year after year. That Mars had oceans billions of years ago. No, the oceans on Mars were recent, within the last 5,000 years, and they were gone. They were stripped away by a large passing comet. But they can't talk about that. The people in tier 1 fully are aware of that. Then you have tier 3. That would be somebody like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who is he's a physicist, PhD, runs the, in New York City, I forget, it's like a museum and planetarium, the Hyde Planetarium. And he's always on the news media, giving his opinion, very standard science. And he will give you an opinion about COVID shots, that you got to get them, this, whatever it is. He's standard. He's Mr. Standard Explanation 101. But he's tier 3. He doesn't do research. He doesn't publish. He might do a little publishing here and there, but that's not his role. He's out there as an outreach person. So that's tier 3 science.
So would he be like the equivalent of Carl Sagan decades ago?
He's Carl Sagan's student. He redid the Cosmos series. So to give you an idea. But that just gives you, and there's a whole flock of people on YouTube, etc., who are tier 3 outreach people. PhDs, they have a YouTube channel. They name call everybody else. And then, by the way, you have whenever the CIA creates a disinformation program like this, they create the opposition too. So then they control them. And this is where Joe Rogan's show comes in.
Yeah,
Right. So they create the opposition, and they're the what I call street people. They don't have any degrees. They don't have any real background and they just spout whatever they want. And then they're easy prey for the white hats from tier 2 science to come in and pick them off. And so this is what you get as science. In the real science, the tier 1 science, you never see. You never see their names. They don't publish. They never publish in peer-reviewed journals. And that's real science, and it's owned and operated by the Vatican Bank. Because what is more important, they already own everything. They already control everything. What do they worship? Secret information.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we pretty much
unto itself. So
yeah. And then tier 4 is like CNN or the space.com
Hmm.
webpage, spaceweather.com, another
Hmm.
webpage, all controlled
If it's
information.
available to the public, then you know most of it's BS, correct?
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, William Casey, head of the CIA back in the 60s, said, when everything that the public knows is false, we will have succeeded. That's what he
Hmm.
said. And that's where we are today.
Yeah, and we got just a couple of minutes. I wanted to circle back to Venus. And Volkevsky had said that Venus was, quote, a young planet. And I believe, from what I'm remembering, and correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of scientists and such, they laughed at him. They thought it was, kind of outrageous and funny. But hasn't that turned out to be the case from everything that we've talked about today? Um, it's a relatively young planet. The conditions there are what he predicted, I believe. I mean, it's hellish.
Yeah.
What we're talking like 900 degrees Fahrenheit, and the surface pressure is like being at the bottom of the Marianas Trench or something. I mean, it's insane.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the result of a large comet becoming a planet. And remember that the Laplacian theory for how the solar system forms, this swirling gas and dust cloud that collapses gravitationally, was designed in the 1700s, and it's still the
It's still
reigning
a model.
theory for how the solar system formed. It doesn't work. I've done entire shows on this. It just anyway.
Yeah.
But there again, nobody can upset the apple cart, and so they just go on year after year. And Mars is a great example. They got these little rovers up there, and they're beaming back information. They're saying, "Oh, billions of years ago there were oceans." Believe me, the real tier 1 scientists have much better equipment up there, and they're excavating the ruins of populations that actually lived there. Mars was a populated planet. It was a sister planet to Earth. And so, like Antarctica right now is being excavated for ruins of ancient cultures which were flash frozen. And so they have a perfect record of history when that happened. And it was within the last 5,000 years.
Yeah, you have to. Everything goes back to Noah's flood, which we know
But,
happened. I mean, every
right.
culture on the planet records a flood happening at exactly the same time. So, what are the
Yeah.
chances of that, right? I mean,
Yeah,
it's
but
crazy.
The Venus event was separate. That was a number of thousands of years after the Noah's flood. Because
Hmm.
what's the Old Testament? The Old Testament is a genealogy from
Yeah.
Noah on down. You start with Genesis on down, and then the Moses event, or the leading the Israelites out of Egypt. That's when Venus came through the solar system. That was the demise of the original Mayans, if you want to call them that, the Olmecs, the Toltecs in
And
Mexico, and all
we got to
around the world.
stop right. We got to stop right there in about 30 seconds. Just let people know how they can watch your show, listen to your show, whatever else. We got to go bye. We're running out of time.
Yeah, well, below my name here are my two websites. jmccsci.com is my main science website. You can get to all of the other pages from there. And then jmccwaterfilters.com is the water filter page, where you can get the best water filter products on the planet. That's my water filter company. Been around for 25 years. So anyway, go there. A lot of information. And my new TV show since July of 2024, we're now about 45 episodes and counting,
Excellent.
but called Master of Science with Professor James McKinney. And then my 25-year running radio show, the James McKinney Science Hour, also Thursday night. But all that information, just go to the web pages there and you will find it.
Excellent. And hey, I'm Kevin Gallagher. I thank you very much for watching. We'll have Professor McKinney back on again, I'm sure. So, folks, hey, every Friday night, 8:30 p.m., and that's then replayed Monday morning at 11 a.m. You can watch us on Charter, and you can watch us Wednesdays, 9 p.m., and then Thursdays at 4 p.m. Truth Be Told Radio Network. You can hear the show Friday nights, 9 p.m. For Professor James McKinney, I'm Kevin Gallagher. Thank you for watching. Please tune in again next week to see what it is we'll be talking about. Hey, until then, God bless. Have a great night.
Okay, and once again, this was an interview conducted by Kevin Gallagher, Truth Be Told Radio Network, and I asked permission to use this as my show for this evening. So we'll talk to you next week.
This has been Master of Science with host James McCanney. Join us each week as James will delve into historical figures such as Nikola Tesla, Albert Einstein, and the great mathematicians as we explore the history of man, Earth, and our universe as you've never seen it before. Tuesdays, 7 p.m. Eastern, right here on the Bold Brave TV network, powered by B2 Studios.